Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode, and this is very interesting. We will discuss on Twitter's hostile takeover. We have our world famous speaker, Professor Rob, Professor David Smith, Mr. Marshall, and Mr. David Schumacher. First, I would like to give chance, Mr. David Schumacher.
Well, hello. What a great and timely topic. We were talking a little bit about that amongst ourselves before the show kicked off about how this is a headline. And it seems like everybody you talk to has an opinion on this. But I think that it really depends on which avenue you want to approach this. Do you want to approach it as the shock of the headline? Do you want to approach it as what does hostile takeovers really mean in corporate America? Probably not too interested in that. I mean, that happens all the time and really doesn't get the headlines. So is it because it's about Twitter? Is that what's going on? Well, perhaps. Twitter is obviously a large, well-known entity in the world. But in its space, it's clearly not the largest. Facebook, Google, others, depending on how you want to measure it, have far more reach and far more money flowing through them than Twitter does. So, or maybe it's about Elon Musk. I mean, here's a larger than life figure that's central in space, what's going on with NASA, pretty much drove the rest of the automobile industry towards electrification. There's a lot of different ways that we could go about approaching this. But I think it's a big headline because of politics. Of course, I have an interest in politics at both the state and federal level here in the United States. And I have an interest in technology, and it seems like Mr. Musk transcends both of those categories pretty well. So perhaps that's the real reason that we're here talking about this. I wonder if there had been a hostile takeover by someone that was less well known, whether that would have been a big difference. Maybe it's the fact that, Musk is reportedly the richest person in the world. That's certainly going to get your interest. But politics, I think, and the spinoff from that, which is the free speech arguments, which Mr. Musk talks about himself, those seem to be the real, perhaps, drivers of the news cycle on this. From what I've read, that about what Musk wants to do, or he wants to take Twitter, on the surface of it, it sounds pretty good to me. I like the fact that if he was to make the algorithm that promotes tweets open source, I think that would be a really good thing. I think transparency would help. I think a lot of what some people call social responsibility and some people call censorship has a lot to do with the transparency of how certain things are promoted, how certain things are suppressed, or perhaps not allowed at all. Another thing that might be good might cost us a little money, and that is moving Twitter to a subscription model, taking it away from advertising. Once again, advertising has an impact on the algorithm because if you want to maximize your income, of which more than half of Twitter's income comes directly from advertising, if you want to minimize that effect on that algorithm is take advertising out of the mix altogether. And if subscribers then are the ones that are paying the way instead of advertisers, perhaps the algorithm, as it develops, hopefully in an open and transparent environment, becomes something that would benefit those who are the subscribers. So I don't think that I think there's a lot of different ways to talk about this. We can talk about other rich people that we know well owning large media companies. Jeff Bezos owns, the Washington Post. And he's done quite a lot of good, I think, for the Washington Post. It's actually been making money since 2013, which it was struggling to do before that, and has had a minimal, from what I can tell, effect on the front page of the Washington Post. Of course, Michael Bloomberg, we all know, has a media company. So there's a lot of high-profile areas. So I take it back to free speech, the politics behind it, and the elements that make that up, primarily the business model and the algorithm, which everybody loves to talk about. Either they love it, hate it, or want it changed. Maybe we can do something about that. So that's what I'll have to say for now. We can come back later and talk about the impact on Tesla, SpaceX, and the other things that Musk is doing. And by the way, I'll leave you with one intriguing thought before I go. What does this have to do? What does Twitter have to do with going to Mars? The reason I ask that question is because Tesla has a role in that. SpaceX clearly has a role in that. The Boring Company has a role in that. And even Neuralink has a role in that. So would it be reasonable to expect that Musk's acquisition of Twitter has nothing to do with going to Mars? I don't think so. I think there's an element there for that. I'd be interested in what other people have to say about that, and then I'll be happy to talk about what I think might be going on. Anyway, that's enough opening remarks for me, Sharif.
Thank you. Mr. Marshall, what do you want to add to this session?
Well, Sharif, I think the opening remarks have been pretty good. I think there's a few other things I want to frame here. Just so everybody knows, I'm going to a destination. I'm driving, so there might be a little background noise. But in addition to that, when I get to my destination, I have to get off. So I'll try to make my remarks succinct right now, probably because I won't probably get to the next round. Essentially, three things that we need to be mindful of. The deal is not inked with him, even though they've reached a tentative agreement. One of the things that Musk did is he made an offer of over $44 billion. That's my second point, but we'll go to that in a second. But $44 billion is a lot of money. And Musk, though, may be the richest man in the world by assets, but he's not the most cash-rich person in the world. So in order for him to fund this, the question is, and this is a question, many people are talking about it, they don't know about it, how is he going to fund it? And what we saw recently, just as of yesterday, and I think we're going to see it continue today, is Tesla's stock is going down. And the further down it goes, the more difficult it is going to be for Musk to raise the capital because he's got to pay cash to these people. It's not in kind. It's not stock transfers. So it's not like he's giving up $44 billion in Tesla or his other companies to Twitter. He's giving cash, and that's a lot of money. And to point that out, and by the way, so nobody knows whether the deal's done or not, because if you can't come up with the cash, the deal's not done. And you framed it, Sharif, as a hostile takeover. So a lot of people feel hostile about it. I've been listening to Twitter feeds all day in forums where people are talking yesterday about this. And there's a lot of people that are Twitter users that are upset. There's a bunch of people that think it's great. A lot of contention about that. The other component about the money is $44 billion for Twitter. Twitter, by the way, is not a media outlet, as was described earlier. It's not the Washington Post. In the United States, the Washington Post is regulated. It has certain regulations it's got to follow. Twitter is a social media outlet. It's not considered a media outlet. And the discussion of free speech in the United States has nothing to do with Twitter per se, because free speech has to do with political free speech as regulated by the government and what you can do in a governmental forum. That's it. All you need to do is take a basic course in constitutional law in the United States and just look it up. It's easy to Google, and then you can tweet about it. But the other component of it is, as everyone knows on this panel and all your viewers, that I'm a big proponent of addressing the climate crisis. In the United States alone, to give you a sense, they're trying to convert a lot of vehicles to electronic vehicles, like the kind that Elon Musk has brought to the table. And The interesting thing about that is the United States has committed a lot of money, according to the government, for the grid to be used a media outlet, but it's used like one, so that it creates some arguments about whether or not these entities can be actually used as should they be regulated. So there's many more discussion topics with Twitter. Should Twitter be regulated? Should social media be regulated in the United States? There's a lot of discussion of that going on right now, and we're going to see more and more of that. So I leave you with 3 points, Sharif and the audience and the rest of the panel. One is, can he actually pay for it in cash? I don't think so yet. He might be able to raise the capital, but then what does that do to his other entities like SpaceX and Tesla and the other entities he owns? So that's one item. Number 2 item is what's his ultimate purpose for that? And the third item is, will this push governmental agencies and the Congress of the United States to legislate laws to cover social media under the same laws as the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the radio stations and television news that propagates throughout the United States? And I'll leave it at that, and I'll listen in. And if I have to leave, I have to leave. Wish everybody the best of luck.
Thank you. Professor David Smith.
Sharif, great topic today. I've loved what we've heard so far. The Twitter acquisition began as a hostile, but as Musk began to pull the money together to do it from both investment banks, he had multiple investment banks step up to him and said, "We want to help fund this." And I know personally some other high net worth individuals who came in and said, I want to be part of this deal. So he pulled together a consortium of people and funds to fund this acquisition. And what really was interesting was at a point where Twitter's board saw that he was pulling together the resources to be able to do it, they actually reached back out to Elon Musk and said, "Let's talk." And there was Twitter shareholders and others who actually petitioned the board to go back and reach out, because the board's responsibility is to be a fiduciary responsibility for the shareholders. And what many of their shareholders went and told them was, "You're not being fiduciary, you're being political." And that could have opened up quite a few shareholder lawsuits against the Twitter board. So even though it's framed as a hostile takeover, and it was initially perceived as a hostile takeover, and the board put in place poison pills to help hold them off, the board did not implement those poison pills. So at that point, the fact that it was a hostile takeover is the facts do not bear that out today as you look at that. Now, having said that, it's interesting to look at the other sides of this. I have a graphic, and I need to find it, that was shared a couple of days ago. If you looked at the donations to political parties that Twitter employees did, that Twitter board members did, it was 98% Democratic donations. So the political leaning of the Twitter leadership, which were the ones required to report, was very much on the Democratic side. And Elon Musk is a libertarian and kind of fits in the middle of all of that. So was there a political element? Most likely. Was it more of a libertarian view of free speech? When Elon Musk at the opening of the Tesla Gigafactory here in Austin, I was at the opening and the barbecue that he put on. And part of his comments there, he actually didn't say, "I'm going to acquire Twitter," but he talked about how free speech has been dying in the United States. So connecting the dots from back then to what has transpired short since then, I believe he approached it mostly from a free speech. And yes, there's benefits, as was pointed out, for his companies. Uh, but I see him more as trying to make a free speech move on this than anything else. And we see that playing out in his comments around the world today as he's looking at that. So that's my initial comments. But I with Elon Musk's headquarters for all his other companies here in Austin, there's a lot of speculation, even at this conference I'm speaking at today in Austin, on whether the Twitter headquarters will be moving to Austin. And it would be real interesting to see if that happens. I wonder the number of people who would move like they did when Oracle moved their headquarters here, or when the Apple II headquarters moved here. So a lot of unknowns, but I think it's exciting to see it begin to be executed. And like I said, even though the topic is hostile takeover, I believe it ended up being more of a fiduciary takeover that their board had to consider and go along with to create value for the shareholders.
Thank you. Professor Rob, what are the interesting things you want to add for today's discussion?
Sure. Topic is hostile takeovers. With regard to hostile takeovers, I've been involved in 4 or 5 of them. 2 of them were converted to friendlies before they were executed. The nature of a hostile takeover is an entity comes in outside of a purchase process and begins the acquisition without the approval or support of the board or majority of the shareholders. So it's an attempt to, by fiat, take a company over, and generally it's predicated by a large monetary sum that can override the board's restrictions. Protections against hostile takeovers are poison pills. The one that Twitter used was designed to lower the value of the shares. Each shareholder would be given the ability to buy at a very reduced price more shares, which would reduce the voting capability of the hostile takeover individual and degrade their shares in terms of value, so hurt them economically. Other poison pill efforts tend to do things like accelerate options for employees, so that their option grants are immediately accelerated and they can execute them. That removes the golden handcuffs that hold employees into the company and allows them to leave, and so the acquirer ends up with a crippled firm. Generally, hostile takeovers, whether they turn into friendly or not, fail to meet their financial goals. And I should point out that most mergers fail to meet their financial goals. And the reason is because both companies don't know a great deal about each other. And normally it's company to company, by the way. We were talking about Tesla, but Tesla's kind of unique. It's a very rich guy basically buying the CEO job at a company that probably wouldn't have hired him because they just phased out their founder, who had 2 CEO jobs, and they wanted somebody that was focused. Musk and focus are not synonymous terms in the market. So they would not have brought him on board voluntarily as a CEO. The pivot from hostile to friendly, at least in my viewing of the takeover, happened when Dorsey, the Twitter founder, blessed the Musk effort. That removed an awful lot of the board's ability to fight it. Dorsey is still a significant holder of Tesla stock, and he, along with his close friends that also hold Tesla stock, represented a voting bloc that would have been very hard to overcome. So it's going forward. Like Marshall pointed out, there are some economic problems to this. Musk he's paying cash, but he's paying cash that is leveraged from his Tesla stock, and the response to this merger has reduced the value of Musk's holdings before the loan was even let. by an equivalence of the purchase price. So economically, his ability to do this has been reduced. On the other hand, he has lined up a series of financial partners to close the gap. But let's go back to why hostile takeovers normally fail, and any takeover fails, and that's because the two parties really don't understand each other much. During the period of due diligence, there are barriers that are put in place that don't allow the company that's doing the acquisition, or the individual in this case, to drill very deeply into the operations of the company that they are acquiring, for fear that approvals won't come through or it'll fall apart, compromising the team. In this particular case, that's not necessarily a problem, because you've got an issue with Elon Musk doing it. He doesn't have a development team. You're not merging two companies for synergy, which is often why mergers are done. You have a company that looks at another company, they want what that other company has, and so they institute a merger process. But with a hostile takeover, as mentioned, you don't even get the due diligence. The company is going to resist any effort to go beyond what the law requires, and the process tends to alienate the employees. So they want to leave. They don't trust management, and feedback out of Twitter right now is anything but friendly for Musk. You could argue it's because of their political leanings, but in every case where I've looked at a hostile takeover, the employees generally turn against the acquirer at the behest of management. And it's very hard once you start to hate somebody or an effort to pivot back. Since I was involved internally to one of those that happened that way, I can certainly say from my own perspective, I didn't really forgive the acquiring company, and I left shortly thereafter. And that's a common occurrence. Operations are disrupted because you get these departures, and people, instead of working, are marketing their resumes outside, and the end result is the company is in pretty poor shape by the time you acquire it. Now, successful hostile takeovers do occur, and they generally occur when the goal isn't to preserve the company, it's to acquire the assets. So when Oracle acquired PeopleSoft, that was a hostile takeover. That was successful, but that's because the goal wasn't to acquire a working company. It was simply to destroy PeopleSoft and acquire its assets, which were its customer base in that case. More recent hostile takeover attempt that failed was Broadcom against Qualcomm. That was rumored to be backfunded by Apple, who wanted to acquire Qualcomm's assets for pennies on the dollar. And that failed. The U.S. government stepped in, identified Qualcomm as a national resource, and recognized that the effort was going to destroy the company, and that the end result would have migrated technology leadership in smartphones to China. So the government stepped in, which doesn't happen that often, but does happen. I do realize that this acquisition still has to go through regulatory approvals. And the SEC in the United States is not a huge fan of Musk, who has pretty much thumbed his nose at them both publicly and privately, and has aggressively not held to requirements that the SEC, which is the organization that governs, to a large extent, governs public companies, has not wed himself to the SEC, who clearly does not like him at all. So we'll see how this plays out. He's going to take the company private. That's actually not a bad idea in this particular case, because as I said, that process is going to cripple Twitter. Taking it private means they don't have to report financials externally, which would have undoubtedly crippled Twitter's valuation and made it look like a failure before it actually failed from an operational standpoint. And so by taking it private, he should avoid much of that. These long-term issues, though, of course, are going to be at any type of employee retention. And the idea of taking the algorithm open source is an interesting one, but in the context of a political environment, it's going to be hard to please both sides. It's likely that both sides will look at that algorithm. Both sides will complain about the biases they perceive, largely because when you already are aligned to one side or the other, you view anything that looks like it might be moderate as biased. So even if they had the most perfect algorithm, it is likely both sides are going to look at that algorithm and say, no, it unfairly favors the other side. And I honestly think it's going to create more controversy as a result, as opposed to less of it. Put another way, political parties are not technology experts, that they don't understand things like open source, and they will react based on what they're told by the experts the supposed experts that they have on board, and those experts will most certainly be biased when they look at the algorithm. So he has an interesting approach to a problem, but I honestly think this is going to blow up on him big time, because you're not dealing with a technical audience who would appreciate the open source nature of the algorithm, but a political audience who won't understand it. And finally, with regard to hostile takeovers, that it really is often more the case of hubris on the acquiring entity to even attempt it. The history, as I say, is largely failure-based, and so you wouldn't, if you had a choice, go down this route to begin with. You would approach it initially, at least, as trying to do a friendly acquisition. You wouldn't immediately jump to hostile. Most of the hostile takeovers I've seen actually started as an initial approach, as a legitimate acquisition, and then pivoted to hostile when the company said no. But you always want to allow the politics to work for you as opposed to against you. And on a hostile takeover, the politics, I'm talking about company politics here, not governmental politics, work against you really badly, because the rank and file are turned against you typically by management, who owns their eyes and ears, at least until you acquire the firm. Very troubling in this particular case is Musk has also started to attack the Twitter leadership publicly, and now that he has been approved for the acquisition, which will also alienate the rank and file. It will look like an unfair and unreasonable attack to somebody that's about to come into power, and will have other methods to regulate the people that report to him, other than doing it in public. It's very much in poor form. And then with regard to free speech, recognize that Musk's history here is very clouded. He disagreed with a first responder trying to rescue the kids that were in the flooded mine, and when that first responder disagreed with his opinion of using a submarine, he framed the first responder as being a pedophile, which was problematic. And that first responder was exercising his free speech rights. More troubling was the whistleblower from inside Twitter. Musk did everything, including pretty much accusing the guy of being a terrorist, for daring to bring forward legitimate problems with regard to Tesla manufacturing, which has had a number of problems over the years. So it really kind of showcases that Musk's view of free speech may surround his free speech and the things he believes in, but he does not have a history of supporting the free speech of others, which is going to be, I think, problematic in this forum. But in the end, it showcases why this had to be a hostile takeover, because the leadership and the rank and file employees of Twitter would not have accepted him through a normal process. And thus, I think he just decided to cut corners and move in this particular fashion, which I expect the odds favor will destroy Twitter over a period of months. And he can afford to keep it afloat, but it's going to be a very costly endeavor, in my opinion.
Thank you, Professor Rob. Professor Donald, what you want to add for this Twitter hostile takeover?
If you ever read the book by Machiavelli called The Prince, and you read it in your mind, and every time he says prince, you substitute CEO, and every time he says country, you substitute company, you'll find that it's absolutely 100% dead on the money. And one of the things he says in it, he says, when you take over another country, he says, do not try to make it be assimilated and make it be part of your country. He says you have two choices. He says you absolutely, completely decimate it and take its resources, which is the PeopleSoft case that Rob just came up with, or you leave it completely alone and you tax it and you take part of the profits basically, but leave it completely alone. Don't mess with it at all. But if you try to get the company, go in there and make it part of your company and try and have it work together, it will always fail. And that's basically what Rob just said about what'll happen with Twitter. I want to give another example is that a writer from a trade publication put a deposit on the Tesla 3, which was very late. And so people who wanted one put a deposit on it, and then when they actually became available, you were in line to get one. And he thought that was pretty lame. He thought that, you know, Musk had kind of screwed up in the process. And he wrote that in an article, and that made Musk mad, and so he removed him from the queue, and he wouldn't sell him a Tesla 3. So that seems very petulant and childish to me. And so Musk means, for free speech, Musk means, I don't know what he means. He's trying to get some points with somebody, but he's not. He absolutely is not about free speech. And what I want to point out is that the algorithm is a deep learning algorithm, and nobody knows how those work anyway. I mean, you can look at the algorithm, but they learn. You know, they do their deep learning thing, but nobody really, you can't reverse engineer and understand why it's doing what it's doing. Deep learning algorithms, that's not how they work. There was an interesting study by Pew Research where they looked at scientists, and they found out that only 1 in 6 scientists considers themselves to be Republican. And so no matter where you go, when you get people that are in science, you're gonna wind up having them be a lot more liberal there's another study that was done where they found out there was a wonderful paper called "Conservative Thinking is Low Effort Thinking." And what they did is they, in various ways, suppressed the frontal cortex of people and found out how willing they were to accept conservative, conservative talking points, like the reason people are poor is because they're lazy, you know, conservative kinds of simple-minded stuff like that. And lo and behold, when their frontal lobes were suppressed by having them do things like work on puzzles or have a drink, they were much more likely to accept those kinds of things. So if you're on Twitter or if you're on one of those places, you find that the conservative people, the Trump people, have a list of about 20 things that they say over and over and over and over and over again. And so, to me, there's a likelihood of what's winding up happening is, since that's the way deep learning algorithms work, since they have such a restricted set of what they say, what's winding up happening is it's being presented in such a way that it restricts. They're not. I really doubt they're being shadow banned. That would be extremely difficult to do. Deep learning algorithms don't work that way. It would be very difficult to do, and it would be incredibly unlikely that they target conservatives. And if you go there on Twitter, just go and start liking a bunch of conservative people and start interacting with people, Dinesh D'Souza, Lauren Boebert, people like that. And all of a sudden you'll find just overwhelmed with MAGA supporters. So I can't comprehend how anybody could think that there was some restriction on conservatives on Twitter. But back to what I think that what Rob said was really, I don't quite understand why Musk is doing it. One theory I have is that that this has caused Twitter stock to go up, and then when the thing falls through, he's going to go, oh, damn, I'm going to have to sell all my Twitter stock, and he's going to make a fortune. I mean, that's one possibility right there. So we'll find out how this actually plays out, because the reason the Twitter is going down is because everybody knows what Rob's saying is true. Is that, I mean, the revenue of Twitter is so small. I mean, that paying $44 billion of it, it'd take you forever to recoup that. I mean, why would he do that? It doesn't make any sense. Twitter doesn't look like it's going crazy, that it's going to make so much money, and there's no real path. I mean, Musk is more of a self-promoter. He buys technology. He doesn't think it up. He doesn't create it. So he's done well at some things, but he's done very poorly at some other things. And so there's no actual reason to believe that he's going to magically pull this off. And I know, because I'm here in Silicon Valley and I talk to engineers, and the basic, and I'm in threads on Twitter with Twitter engineers, and they're basically saying there is no way in hell I'm moving to Texas. And so basically everyone around here is saying, well, there's a huge deficit of engineers right now. So all the companies around are rubbing their hands together with glee, saying, oh boy, there's going to be a whole bunch of Twitter engineers that we can hire right now. This is just great. And so it's going to be very, very difficult for them to be able to keep the intellectual capital that they have in their company, and be able to keep the company happy and stable, and being able to keep running. So I don't know. I just don't buy this free speech thing, because the free speech that they're complaining about is the ability to put disinformation about COVID, which is one of the things that they blocked on Twitter, to put disinformation about the election, which was people running around saying that the election was stolen and stuff like that, and all kinds of things that are just basically dangerous and divisive, that are not true. And sometimes we can see the source is deliberate propaganda, whose absolute point is to create social problems. And they've done it in the United States, but they've also do it aimed at other countries too. And it's absolutely 100% shown that it's being done by things like, what was it called? The Internet something agency it was paid for by Russia, and it was actually out of Ukraine, so that the trolls dropped off quite a bit for a while there after the war started. But it's coming out of North Korea, China, and Russia on purpose. And so censoring those, I mean, I don't see that that's a matter of free speech. And then lastly, if you read the U.S. Constitution, it's that the government isn't allowed to basically stop people from saying whatever they want, up to a degree. I mean, you're not allowed to, conspire with people to murder people or overthrow the government and stuff like that. But so Twitter isn't the government, and Twitter employees feel that they have a responsibility to not hurt people. They don't want Twitter to be something that's causing people to die. I mean, they feel that they have a responsibility. They call it the health department, where they're trying to make it be that Twitter doesn't hurt people. That's what they're doing. They're not trying to suppress free speech. They worry about it as much as anyone else. So think that we'll wait and see and find out what really happens. It's not over till it's over.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor David Shubakar, what is your concluding remarks for today's session?
Fascinating points of view, one and all. I appreciate all of that input. And I do want to talk more about free speech because I think that's clearly part of what's going on, but maybe not in U.S. First Amendment way of thinking about free speech. So let me see if I can explain that. In the United States, I think, as Donald pointed out, it's the First Amendment applies to government's interaction, not to businesses. And I see two camps, one that points to that specifically and another one that tends to want to make free speech universalized. I realize in Europe and in other places around the world, the whole free speech arguments are pointed differently. So how can this be about free speech on an international basis? Well, I think it has to do with social pressure. I think that is part of what's going on here. So what I mean by that is if Elon Musk decides to apply First Amendment language to his business, if it does turn out to be his business, then that is a voluntary acceptance as far as business is concerned to focusing on this idea of free speech. I think that plays pretty good in a lot of circles, plays especially good perhaps in the libertarian and conservative areas here in the United States. But I remember a time back when the left had an issue with things that they determined that were free speech. So I think there may be some seeds there that might take longer to germinate on the far left side of the political spectrum, but I do think they're there. So talking about free speech may be more important than doing something about free speech. And that may be what's going on here with the free speech argument. As a matter of fact, since there's such a great political divide in the US, whatever gets done about the algorithm, whatever gets done and talked about, if both political sides are finding fault with it, to some degree, that's a level of success because now he can say that it's evenly balanced. And the fact that both sides are complaining about it is a good thing. So I think the social pressure is certainly part of that. I think that the things that I talked about earlier, going to an advertising model, talking about opening the algorithm up, whatever that turns out to mean, will probably play well when it comes to social pressure. And then the one that I failed to mention earlier was verification of accounts, making sure that accounts actually belong to human beings, because by some accounts, there are huge amounts of bot accounts on Twitter. And those are the ones that manipulate information either by political or ideological points of view, or even maybe actors outside of governments outside of the United States trying to manipulate public opinion. So I think that third one too, about verifying accounts that are human, is really, really important. So if it's about political pressure, if it's about social pressure, maybe some of those things make sense. I really liked the comments that Donald had about perhaps there's an economic pressure here at work too. And I think that has to be given some consideration, especially if you paid attention to Elon Musk and Dogecoin and all of what went on with that and all of the talking points about that. So concluding remarks is what you called for, Sharif, so I'll leave you with that. If Elon Musk does ultimately take over Twitter, do you want to bet against whatever it is that he's doing, even if we don't understand it. Because those that bet against him early on in electrical vehicles didn't fare so well. And the same things about those who bet against him early on in his space endeavors. It didn't work out so well for them either. Perhaps that will be what will happen with Twitter. Twitter has languished stock-wise and in market growth-wise now for quite a while. If he can move that forward, that will be some degree of success, and that will have to do back again, both with social pressure and with economic pressure. So maybe he can get Twitter unstuck. Maybe he can move it along the way that he's done with his other industries. And maybe it will be the first social platform on Mars. So we'll see. Thanks, Sharif.
Thank you. Professor David Smith, what's your concluding remarks for today?
Thank you for doing this program today. I believe it's there, and you can see there's a diversity of opinions as we look at this and how it's going. One of David's comments at the end, I really think is worth noting that earlier this year, the Twitter stock was trading at $73.34 a share. And if you look at the offer that was made for it at 54, you can see that the stock has been on a steep decline this whole year. And you see that. The other thing that was interesting that was tweeted about this earlier was that Musk tweeted that Truth Social is ranked #1 on the App Store above Twitter. And they are, in some sense, competitors when you look at this. The slide you have up is a slide that was published looking at all the top tech companies. And if you look at the Twitter one, which is one that's highlighted, they are 98.7% of all their donations went to the Democratic Party. And so if I were to look at the leanings of a company, that's it. The attorney at Twitter, which actually negotiated part of the deal with Musk when she was talking to her employees about, actually cried about it because she was concerned that the acquisition would change the leanings of Twitter and its impact there. And that even raised the fear more about what's going to happen in the probably 6 months it's going to take to go ahead and be able to have approval and the deal executed. And we see that coming and how it can be used. Twitter already has some development presence here in Austin. And what's interesting is in one of the Austin chat channels for technology, and there's actually at this conference today, I'm speaking at a couple of Twitter employees here. And in the morning session, I actually asked them about it. And they said, Silicon Valley is upset. All the employees here think it's a great deal. So again, I think you see cultural differences as you look through this and what's there. It's important, though, to kind of put out on the table that Musk is not a Democrat and Musk is not a Republican. And he goes to great extent to say he's not. He describes himself as a libertarian. And so to me, that takes a little bit of the politics out, even though he believes that Twitter has swung way too far to one side. I can tell you, I've been in Twitter jail for some of the things I've posted on Twitter. And I had my account taken down for a couple of weeks. And I tell you what I had posted was not on any extreme, pretty much in the middle. So I've been a victim of the Twitter police and the algorithm and stuff. And it took quite a bit of going back to them and say, look, read what was there. And they eventually reinstated my account, but they actually had put my account offline. So I've personally been impacted because I probably tweet 20 things a day on Twitter. And I had people emailing me going, are you okay? We haven't seen anything from you. And so it is a vehicle that a lot of people use. And it's one that I think is important. Do I think when the acquisition is approved, and I do think this one will be approved, uh, it's going to be very interesting to see because like Donald said, I believe there will be a mass exodus of particularly employees in the California operations of Twitter. Uh, but on the other hand, I think it's not going to be as severe as a lot of people think. When Oracle moved their headquarters here from California, I'm surprised how many employees came from Silicon Valley. When Apple opened and expanded their operations, I'm surprised how many Silicon Valley employees came here. Um, we see 156 new people every day moving to Austin, and the vast majority of those are from California. In Texas, we see a little bit over, according to the Secretary of State, over 1,000 people a day moving from California to Texas. So uh, even though Texas might have a reputation in some, but Texas is pro-business, and Texas does not have a personal income tax. And the taxes on corporations are realistic here, and the amount of policies that are tried to enforce are realistic. So those are some of the differences. Um, Was I surprised with the speed that this went from initial announcement, the initial pushback, to when it closed? This is one of the fastest acquisitions I've seen in a long time, particularly an acquisition of this size. Um, and uh, Today, tomorrow, we should see the statement from Twitter's board. They're required to file the details of the merger agreement within 4 days. We haven't seen that yet. What we have seen is some leaks from their two financial advisory companies that briefed the board over the weekend about the valuation, the impact of this on valuations and stuff. Uh, and their view is that it was going to be a positive movement for the company and that it would increase the shareholder value and be positive. Like I said, their stock this year went from $73 down into the low 40s. And so this year has been a steep decline in their valuation and in their shareholder value. So uh, it had to be in the fiduciary responsibilities of the board to go ahead and negotiate and approve this merger. Otherwise, they would have not been doing their duties as a board member. Now, when we see what the proxy vote is, we need to see that as well. But it's hard to understand that when your stock lost 40% of its value in the last 4 months, not to see this as a good deal for shareholders. So again, my view is that it probably will go forward. Staying out of the technology view, but I do believe that having been in Twitter jail for weeks, that their policies do need some moderation from where they are because they were really too far to one side extreme versus the other one. And, just looking in today's world, Putin still has his account on it. The leader of North Korea has his Twitter account. And even as you look at the policies that they're doing, they're not equal and fair. And whether a company needs to be equal and fair is a different debate. But as a private company, it can be enforced to be more equal and fair than it can as the public company it is today. So, Sharif, thank you so much for having me on this. And I'm very glad I made it back to Austin in time to do it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor David Smith. Professor Rob, what's your concluding remarks?
Well, so I'm going to disagree with David on one comment. The public company is regulated. A private company is not. Regulations are typically what require a company to be equal and fair. Whether it has to do with discrimination and diversity or the nature of their message. As soon as you're private, those restrictions drop off, and now you fall under whatever other regulations that aren't tied to a public company. The EU has stepped up almost immediately and indicated that Twitter will still be held to a relatively robust set of rules that they have put in place to assure that their citizens are not polluted by fake news. The underlying concept of fake news is problematic because it's inherently biased by the political party that is designating the term. But the removal of Twitter from a public company to a private company removes controls. It doesn't add controls, and it will allow them to do things that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do. On the other hand, it's one of the ways you turn a company around. Michael Dell took Dell private. Had to take Dell private because in the current environment, the controlling interests of shares are largely held by hedge funds who are wedded to quarterly returns, and it makes you very difficult to do strategic things like massively change the company for the future. And at least in the United States, the ability for companies to pivot on technology or cultural change is much reduced because of that. Because typically, when you have to pivot, you have to take a short-term loss for what will be a long-term gain, and the current market environment does not allow you to do that. So they're not without punishing the stockholders and the executives that are compensated on company performance. It just doesn't work. So effectively taking the company private is the best practice if you're going to try to turn the company around, and that's what Musk is doing. But it will remove controls from him, and given his history with regard to free speech, I too have doubts with regard to his ability to handle an unbiased to provide an unbiased way to regulate the conversations. A lot of talk about relocating Tesla, relocating Twitter to Austin. It is interesting to notice that a lot of people that have been relocated to Austin have done very well from California. But do recognize that Austin is kind of a liberal part of Texas. It is, compared to the rest of Texas, it is incredibly liberal, and the environment is very California friendly. So it wouldn't be like moving them to Dallas, which I imagine would have had a much lower uptick in terms of interest. But Austin's a lovely place to live, and relatively balanced in terms of its politics, even though it's liberal in reference to the rest of Texas. But back to the mergers and acquisitions. This isn't a merger. This is an acquisition. It began as a hostile acquisition. There's nothing to merge, and so some of the problems you typically have in a merger won't occur here because it's not like he's going to be folding Twitter into Tesla. At least as far as we know, he's not going to do it. Even his fold in of the solar company, I can't think of its name right now, into Tesla wasn't a full merger. Though that was questioned at the time with regard to how much pressure Solar City was going to apply to Tesla's bottom line. It was an adverse impact, certainly initially to Tesla. I'm still not seeing the result as being positive, but the goal of that merger was that Solar City was going under, and it was another one of Musk's companies. So he had Tesla buy it using a company where he had been successful to hold up a company where he had not. And that did keep Solar City alive, and it didn't cripple Tesla so badly that it went under. But it can show a problematic issue with Musk's decisions, in that he will make decisions that appear to be for his best interest, but not particularly for the best interests of the companies that he holds and manages. Solar City was not a good deal, and still is not a good deal for Tesla. It may eventually become one, But for much of the solar market, manufacturing sadly moved over to China. It wasn't competitive in the U.S. And granted, China did things we might argue was illegal with regard to the solar industry in terms of dumping and selling below cost. But that's the nature of competing in a world market. And at that time, the U.S. government did not protect the U.S. solar industry, and it kind of collapsed. Another indicator of problems ahead really are how Musk and the SEC interact. Musk and the SEC have been at loggerheads quite a bit, and for silly things, for things like telling people that he was going to take Tesla private when he wasn't and didn't have the funds to do so. And he's made a number of comments publicly about things that he supposedly was doing that he wasn't doing, that did weird things to Tesla stock and landed him into a world of hurt. So taking Twitter private, another way to avoid the SEC, but he still has to get regulatory approvals because it is a public company now. And even though the U.S. may not restrict him very heavily with regard to what he does with Twitter, the EU is stepping up, sees the risk, and the fines from the EU have caused companies as large as Google and Microsoft to change policies. They are a fining entity, and they can fine them millions of dollars a day if they don't like what it is you're doing. And for a company that's already not exactly extremely profitable, that could be problematic for Twitter and for Musk's reserves, because as has been pointed out, he's largely funding this by leveraging his Tesla stock. That's going to be problematic as well. As we mentioned, Tesla stock is down on the news, down sharply. That's the basis for the loans, which reduces its capability to raise capital. Not their critical point yet, but it is showing some headroom. Also recognize that while everybody's pointed out that he's libertarian, not Republican, libertarian is a conservative side of politics in the U.S. It is not by no means liberal. The vast majority of Tesla buyers are liberal. The vast majority of states where Tesla sells in are liberal. That's an interesting piece of information, only because the reason that is because in many conservative states, people that govern, people in politics, own dealerships. And so they moved against Tesla's retail model and blocked the retail stores of Tesla in their states, which is why Tesla does really well on the East and West Coast, but not so great in the middle. They can't raise stores, and they are increasingly blocked from selling into those states by conservatives. And so the support of conservatives for Tesla isn't even lukewarm at best. It's largely supported by the liberal population in the United States. And if he does turn Twitter into a libertarian platform, it's very likely he'll be punished on the Tesla side, because his buyers will and have in the past boycotted companies they don't believe are performing appropriately. And it comes at an odd time, at a time when everybody and their brother are coming to market with competitive cars. Tesla has a bad history here. Donald pointed out an issue with regard to a reporter. Another issue I'm aware of is where somebody returned the car because it was so bad. Tesla's had a horrible quality reputation ever since it came to market. And there was a buyer, a social media activist, that returned his car, and I think it's been 18 months now, and he hasn't received his money back. It's those kinds of stories that hover around Tesla. Not to mention the large number of buyers that got cars that were incomplete and were poorly assembled, and then had to deal with those issues. It's kind of ironic, only because electric cars by nature tend to be far more reliable than ICE cars. It was just Tesla's manufacturing process that was at risk. But they survived and did well because they were really the only game in town if you wanted to go electric. And the liberal side of the United States is aggressively electric. So they rode that particular wave. But this purchase of Twitter may shoot that wave straight in the head and shift buying behavior to other companies like Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors, who are all rolling out electric cars. Could really help Ford, who's struggling at the moment getting their electric cars to market, and their stock has been pounded. Any weakness in Tesla has to be a benefit to them. So, every dark cloud has a silver lining. This one may be one for Ford, who's had a real trouble competing with Tesla. throughout Tesla's history. It is also ironic that Tesla's valuation is several times Ford's valuation, who has far more cars and far more reach in the U.S., particularly with regard to trucks, which Tesla has failed to deliver as of yet. So there's an interesting dynamic here, but I think we're going to find one way or another whether very rich people buying companies, and by the way, the motivation here appears to be to the fact that Musk really didn't like being moderated. He really wanted his views to get out, and he has been moderated by Twitter. And I would not surprise me to see on his first day as CEO that he fires a number of people at Twitter that he views have rubbed him the wrong way or done something that he feels is improper. Very much a Steve Jobs mentality in that regard. And if you look at the two men, Steve Jobs, of course, has passed, a very similar behavior traits in both. Vindictive, almost to extremes at time, history of abuse of power, but also high degrees of brilliance and execution, offsetting that, allowing them to reach success levels, but almost always on the cusp of failure. So watching Musk is often like watching somebody running with scissors, but so far he hasn't fallen on them. And betting against the guy has been, as David has pointed out, has been not been a lucrative pastime. He has succeeded where other people have failed. But as I say, he's always very close to the edge. When people run this close to the edge, there's always a chance they're going to step over. And none of his properties are invulnerable to politics. SpaceX is very dependent on the U.S. government. Tesla is very dependent on liberal leanings towards electrical power and solar energy. The Boring Company is going to require a great deal of government support to even operate, and it's kind of struggling. And Hyperloop is going to require a great deal of government support to even get to the point where they've got a running train. So going into something like Twitter, I think he's going to find is incredibly problematic because it's going to polarize very much the government entities that he's going to have to depend upon for many of his other businesses. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to be watching this one from a distance because it's got all the earmarks of a cascading collapse, but recognize that Musk's history would suggest a positive outcome, where I'm suggesting that the overall market dynamics and politics would suggest anything but. So it's going to be interesting to see how this really plays out, because the two elements almost are in balance, and you flip a coin and it could go either way. I do want to correct one other thing. David Smith said this is the fastest merger he's ever seen. It's not done. We don't even have formal board approval yet. It's still got to go through due diligence. It still has to go through both domestic and foreign approvals. It is a public company still. That's still a process that's got to occur, and board approval is a critical part of the process, but not the end all be all, because this is a public company and it is still regulated. So those things still have to conclude. It will be far simpler than a merger, though, because Musk doesn't have to go in and learn anything about Twitter, and they don't have to try to line different organizations. From an operational standpoint, it should be pretty clean as far as him taking over, because a lot of the moving elements are moved. There's no competitive aspects to this. Though if I were Ford or GM, I might raise my hand and say, giving a competing car company 100% access to what is a media channel might be considered anti-competitive, but I don't think that effort would be successful, given the different businesses and history here would be in Musk's favor. So I'm saying this is going to be interesting. I wouldn't want to be a Twitter employee going through this. I wouldn't want to be a Tesla employee going through this, because it's all aggravation that you can't control. But as an analyst, this is going to be a lot of fun.
Thank you. Professor Donald, what's your concluding remarks for today?
I want to say I got completely kicked off of Twitter for making a joke about Trump. And what happens is that the Twitter conservatives organize, and they make lists of people they don't like, and then they mass report you. And then the Twitter algorithm kicks you off. And so you have to be very careful. I know people with 25,000 followers who've gotten kicked off. And so you've got to check the list that you're on, because if they don't like you, they'll gang up on you. And the left-wing people don't do that. It's something that the right-wing people do. To me, the idea that the algorithm is biased towards right-wing people is kind of funny, because I've never seen it. But of course, I'm mostly in contact with people that are more on the left wing, so I wouldn't see it. But yeah, no, I got completely kicked off, and I had to create a new account. The new account has 11,000 followers, so I get to hear from quite a few people. But in any event, I think Rob's insights have been very useful for me, very interesting to listen to. It's hard to know what he's doing. Maybe when Rob was talking, I was thinking maybe he's counting on a large Republican victory in the midterms, and he's going to be able to use this to try and drum up a bunch of support from the Republicans so that he can continue with the huge amount of government support that he's been able to get. It's interesting, I read Bezos's book, and there's one point in there where Bezos tells his minions, they say, why is Musk getting so much money from the government and we're not getting money from the government? Go out there and find out how we can start getting money from the government too. He says he's doing this much better than we are. And he sent his minions out to try and figure out how to start getting money from the government to the degree that Musk does, which I think is always so amusing, because he's this, pound on the chest libertarian who basically funded his company by getting money from the government. The hypocrisy is always amazing. So anyway, we're just going to have to wait and see. It's a tough road to hoe. It's the one thing that Rob said that I think is very interesting is, as I said, I do hear from quite a few people since I have 11,000 followers right now, and the consensus of people never buying a Tesla again is pretty much uniform. And I think that there's Lucid is another company that's making high end, and apparently they're meeting all of their goals. I mean, they're getting them manufactured exactly when they said they were going to manufacture them, and they're very high quality. So there's some really great competition to Tesla now. And one of the things that Rob mentioned about the conservative states not even allowing Tesla to be sold, they also fought tooth and nail against charging stations. So California, there's like, if I go down to CVS, they have a bunch of charging stations we don't even have to pay for. We just hook our car up to a charging station. It's just, they're there in the parking lot. The parking lots of shopping centers have charging stations all over the place. So California, they just keep appearing. There's more and more of them every day. But my gather in a lot of the red states, they're few and far between. So by kind of aiming completely at the conservative market, the way that Elon's doing right now, he might actually be putting Tesla through a period where their sales might not be as good as he'd like them to be. It's an interesting thought. I appreciate Rob bringing that up.
Thank you. This is really interesting discussion, and I believe that it will be helpful for our audience. I request all of our audience, please share our content with your government, corporation, and academy. Thank you, Mr. David Schumacher, Professor Rob, Professor Donald, and Professor David Smith for your continuous support for World Internet Economy Forum. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye.